I'm Amanda from the Quilting Bee in Masson, Ohio, and today I wanted to show you a quick tutorial on a great way to use up your scraps, and that's making a mug mat. Sometimes they're called a mug rug, mug mat, but either way, it is a quilt as you go method. It's a great way to use your stash up and get some of those scraps put to a good use. Since we're entering the timing of the year where we go on a lot of vacations, maybe you're visiting relatives, you're using a Verbo and you'd like to leave a little hostess gift, some mug mats for you, your fellow travelers, or your hostess or hostesses is a great way to say thanks. This one that I'm holding in particular, I did sort of a wonky log cabin, starting with my center square and then went around. I'm gonna do a slightly different method on the tutorial, but it's a quilt as you go method. So it's just a great 20-25 minute project, and you have a neat little hostess gift, or just something to stash around your house for when you want to have a cup of coffee and a snack. So stay tuned. So our mug mats will finish at about 5.5 by 10.5 inches rectangularly. If you want to go smaller, you can go smaller. This is just the basic size that we do. So the kinds of things you need to make yourself a mug rug: you need a scrap piece of batting. So this is a little bit larger than the piece of backing you're going to need. We trim our backing to be 5.5 by 10.5 inches rectangularly so that we know exactly what size we're working with, and we're going to trim this out. You need basting spray, just a quick little spritz to keep everything in place because this is a quilt as you go. You need a ruler. This happens to be 10.5 by 5.5 inches, but whatever ruler you have is fine. A pair of scissors so you can cut your pieces to size. Your rotary cutter, of course, and your box of scraps. So if we open this up, I have all kinds of scraps in here, but I've already gone through and selected what I'm going to use on this particular mug rug. So I have those scraps ready to go. So let's get started. So as I said, the first thing we're going to do is just put a little spritz of the basting spray on each side to keep our backing in place as we do the quilt as you go. So I'm not worried about overspray because I'm not doing a big spritz. I'm just literally quick spray, press that down, bring this over, quick spritz, flatten that, and you're good to go. Now I'm going to trim this up. I'm going to trim this to the size of my backing. So as I'm doing the quilt as you go, I know exactly where my stop points are. So let's trim this up. So now with this piece trimmed up nicely, we're going to turn it over and get started. So because I'm doing one side as a solid piece, this solid piece measures 5.5 inches square. So what I'm going to do to make sure that as I'm quilting my smaller pieces, I leave enough room, is actually come onto this mug mat and measure 5.25 inches and just mark a line so that I know where I can stop with my other pieces over on this side. And I'm just going to mark it with whatever I happen to find. Doesn't have to be a really dark line. It's just sort of a line of demarcation. So I know I don't need to do any more quilting beyond this line. So this is going to be this piece, and this is going to have my scraps. I think the pattern I'm going to do on this, and again, the wonky log cabin, I just started with a center piece, and then my next piece I laid on one side, and then the next piece that measured the length of those two pieces combined, and I just kept going in that direction. I sewed that piece. The purple piece ran from the side of that teal down to the orange, and then again coming down the pink, the blue, and then the yellow. So you can do any method you want. I think on this particular mug mat, I want something that's a little bit more sort of in this vein. So I'm going to trim this centerpiece down because he's way too wide. But I think I'm just going to do 3 across and then 1 at the top and call it a day. So what you want to do is, I'm putting this square piece aside right now because I don't need that yet. I'm just going to start taking my pieces, and like I said, I think that's going to be at my top. So I'm going to lay my first piece here right along, face up, my line of demarcation. So I'm just going to, and I want to make sure when I'm at the top that I'm not going to encroach too much, but I don't also want to have any batting showing. So I'm going to start right about there. And I'm just going to lay that right along my line of demarcation, if you will. And I'm just going to do a stitch all the way down and then repeat and do a couple more stitches to literally quilt as I go. So here's that first piece, just quilted a few rows onto it. You do want to, after you've attached each piece, go back and clean up your threads because you're going to have threads all over the place. But if you flip it over, you can see it's already getting quilted. So that's why it's the Quilt As You Go method. You can also see I have this extra flap here. I'm going to trim that off just so I don't get it caught in anything, but we'll be giving this a nice trim when we're done anyways. So if you leave it, that's fine too. So then for my next piece, I think I'm going to use this pretty little watercolor. So once you're ready to attach your second piece, you're actually going to turn it so the pieces are right sides together. And as you can see, I don't need all this extra length here. So I'm going to trim that off. And again, I'm not trying to be too precise. I'm just trying to get the bulk of what I don't need off. So you want to give yourself a nice little overlap of those two pieces. And I'm just going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam down. Give that a nice finger press and then quilt this piece. So my second piece is on. And I think I'm going to add this daisy as my last piece, and I'm just going to overlay it, and it will take me right to that edge. Again, this piece is a little long, so I'm going to trim that off. Not trying to be too precise because I know we'll give it a good trim. And get that attached. Again, 1/4 inch seam. And so for my last piece, I'm going to take this pretty watercolor. Now you can see I got a little crooked here. So what I need to make sure is that I get enough coverage. See how much overlay I'm going to need? So if I lay that edge to edge and eyeball that for straightness, I don't think this is going to be quite wide enough. So I'm going to go see what else I have. I might have a larger piece of this that I can use. And I found a slightly larger piece of scrap. I'm not going to worry about trimming this off because I know it's all going to get trimmed in the end. So again, because I know I'm crooked up at the top versus the bottom, I'm taking my piece to my very inside point and then stitching my 1/4 inch, and we'll quilt that. Okay, so this first piece, this first side is done. So now I'm just going to take my other half and lay it, again, making sure, well, for one thing, this has writing, so I want to make sure it's going to be facing correctly. But see how it's just a little curved in up here? I'm going to make sure I put my piece at the most inside edge because I can always trim a little bit off the end if I need to, but I want to make sure I catch that. So I'm just going to stitch down there a 1/4 inch. Give that a nice finger press. And I can see I'm going to be a little short on this guy. I'm just going to trim that off. I'm not going to lose any sleep on it. So since I knew I wasn't going to be able to cover that whole piece of batting. I had some extra. I just went ahead and trimmed that off just so it wouldn't distract me. And when I go to quilt this side, I think I'm going to do it at a diagonal. So that means rather than pull it off, snip my threads, and keep going, I'm actually going to leave my needle down and just use my edges to come down and around. So what I mean is I'm going to start here. So I'm going to start right to where that edge is, straighten it a bit, go down a few. I just keep lifting my presser foot. Come to the edge, leave it down so I can stitch down the edge a bit, put my foot down, come down a few. Okay, so now that we have this all quilted, yes, it's pretty wonky, but we're just going to trim it up. Now, if you recall, my backing piece was nice and straight, so I'm just going to use that as my guide and just trim. So there's my mug mat. Our next step is going to be binding. So when it comes to binding, I've done a lot of quilts. And I always end up with leftover binding. So I keep all my extra binding because it comes in really handy when I'm doing some mug rugs. So I happen to have a container of binding. I'm going to use this purpley pink. Oh, it turns out it has some princess. Maybe I won't use this since it's not going to a child. Maybe I'll use this blue. The blue has a bunch of different colors in it. It'll be really pretty. You just want to make sure you've got enough to go around your mug rug. You could measure it or you could do this. That'll be plenty. I'm actually going to cut this off because I already know I don't need this whole piece. So that's if you've got leftover binding. If you don't have leftover binding and you need to make your own, Judy is working on a tutorial for how to make your own binding. I'm going to do a quick tutorial right now. So generally speaking, we're just going to keep this simple. You want to use 2.5-inch strips by width of fabric, so the long pieces. So extra jelly roll strips are really good for making extra binding. Scraps from your past quilts. You want to attach all of your strips so you have one long strip of binding. So the first thing you do is you take however many 2.5-inch strips you have, and your inclination would be to just attach them this way. You don't want to attach them vertically. We're actually going to turn your next piece right sides together at a 90-degree angle. And if you need to, if you don't have a good guide on your machine, you might want to do this. You want to stitch from one corner, your inner corner, to that bottom corner. You're going to stitch along this line to attach your pieces. And you're going to repeat that for however many strips you have to make your binding. So let's take this to the machine. So again, you're going to align. You need to make sure you're at the center of your needle and that you're keeping this centered. Now, if you notice, I have tape on my machine that marks my center point with my needle. It aligns with the line that's on my bobbin case. So I know when I line up a project where I have to sew corner to corner and keep it straight, I'm keeping this bottom point of my blue line on that red line in the center. So then what happens, you would take this to the iron, press it, but you end up with just a continuing even piece of binding. You would then, after you attached all your strips, you can cut this extra away to the right of your stitch line so you don't have all that bulk. Take it to the iron, and you're just going to press with those two edges together. Just press that down the middle, keep going, and you've just made binding. I already have my binding made. I'm going to go ahead and attach it, and I'm going to attach it starting at the back. So when I finish it, I'm finishing to the front. It's just what my personal preference is. I'm going to start attaching it to one of my long sides of my mug mat, and I'm going to start about 3 inches from the bottom. Notice I'm leaving a tail of binding. Just let that go, and just start here about 3 inches from the bottom, sewing that 1/4 inch seam. You're going to stop when you get about 1/4 inch from that edge. So I just use my finger just to sort of place hold. Lift up your foot, lift up your needle, pull it out a bit, and you're going to fold your binding up and then back down so that you have a 90-degree angle, okay? So I'm going to show you again on the next corner. So I pulled it out. You pull your tail all the way up, straight up, bring it back down. You want to keep the edge of the binding here along the edge of your mug rug. But see how that's a nice straight 90-degree angle? And then you're going to start stitching right at the very top of that binding. You could back tack if you like. Pull everything up, out. I'm turning it up again, bringing it back down, holding it in place while I pivot my project and sort of get everything realigned again. So right at that corner, and keep stitching. Now, I still have this tail to contend with, so I'm going to take this down a few more stitches and then actually back tack, because I'm going to take it off the machine. So you can see I have way too much binding here. So what I'm going to do is first just trim this off there. And then get this to be a more manageable piece. So I'm just going to trim this off. Notice I'm overlapping about 2 inches from that end piece. But then what you want to do is, to get this to lay nice and flat, we are going to eyeball about 1/4 inch from where this overlaps, because we're going to attach these two pieces. So you can use a ruler if you really need to. I'm just going to estimate right about there. Snip that off. And then we're actually going to attach these two together at the machine. So open up this piece and open up your other end. Lay them right sides together. And because our project is nice and small, you can actually just fold this in half and this will go a lot smoother. So we're going to align these right sides together and go stitch a 1/4 inch seam at the machine. So I stitch there. So now if I lay this down flat, fold everything back in, you can see it lays nice and flat. So I'm going to finish attaching this to the back, and then we just sit at the machine, turn it, bring it to the front, and stitch all the way along. We're almost there. So again, I like to start on a long edge, and I'm just going to stitch right along the edge of my binding to attach it. So I'm using my foot, let's see if I can zoom in, to just catch that edge so it's nice and flush. Give it a little back stitch. As you're coming to the corner here, there's going to be some bulk. You're going to have some of these threads. You might want to try to clean it up a little bit just so it doesn't all get all frayed. You're just going to fold in like you were doing a package. Fold this end up so you can catch it with your needle as you come to the edge. It gets a little tricky. You have to finagle a little bit, but I believe in you. Pivot and keep going. Sometimes we have to massage that in there a little bit to catch it. So there you have it. It's a great way to use up your scraps and also have a nice little gift for someone. Thanks. See you next time.